Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about anchor points and how we can leverage anchor points to add an extra level of detail to our objects. So I have here a saddlebag that I want to use for my motorcycle model. Now, if everything's baked and it's ready to be textured, and so if I come up and just add a quick leather texture, let that load. Okay, I have this leather texture, and I also want to add maybe a brass texture to this hardware area. Now you can see this is a good start, but it's missing some pretty crucial detail that separates it from a really realistic texture from a stylized texture. One of those things is stitching. Luckily, Substance Painter has a lot of stitching brushes. So if I searched here, I have all of these stitching patterns that I could use to add detail around the edges. And again, you can always work through how the best way to add that stitching pattern is. Generally, when I add a brush like stitching or any sort of brush effect, I like to first add a fill layer, then, let's add that fill layer to the bag, and then I like to add a black mask. Now, you notice we could just use a layer, just kind of a brush layer, and then choose our brush and then just brush on top. But there's a pretty gaping problem with this. When we add details like this, it's destructive, which means we can't really modify this without using the erase tool. And even with the erase tool, if we have overlapping lines, it gets really complicated to manage. That's why I like to use fill layers with masks, because we can brush on a texture, and then we can obviously get rid of some of that texture by changing the color of the mask. But another really cool thing is if we come over to this fill layer, we can change the color of kind of the stitching indefinitely. And so that's something you also can't do with just a normal layer because it's destructive. And so if we wanted a different colored stitch, we'd have to erase and then reapply. And so this just gives you a lot more flexibility. Now let's take that off, and then let's just add a little bit of stitching around this bag. So if I click on my stitches and go to the mask, I can obviously draw where I want my stitching to go, but there are ways to be a little bit more precise. One way you can do that is if you click, hold down Shift, and then click again, Substance Painter will draw your line completely straight. So if we click Shift, and then click again with Shift held down, it gives us kind of a guide or a straight edge to create our texture with. I'm going to kind of go quickly through this just to this point. Now you'll notice another issue with this texture, and that is it's completely flat, and it looks like it's been spray painted onto this other texture. That's one of the issues we have with just painting on textures. We lose some of the detail, or we miss out on some of the detail that this texture would have had if we were actually stitching into leather. Now, this is a situation where something called anchor points is really, really useful. Anchor points, simply put, is a way for Substance Painter to reference a previous bit of information in your texture and use it for something else. And so in this situation, we're going to reference this mask here, and we're going to use it to create some indent and some extra detail for our stitching pattern. So in order to add an anchor point, you just have to click on your mask or whatever you want to be referenced. Then if you come up to Add Effect and down to Add Anchor Point, it will give you kind of this anchor icon, and you can rename that. So I'll rename that Stitches. Now what I'm going to do, because the first thing I want to attempt to do is kind of get an indent on the stitching pattern so that it more closely kind of follows what you'd expect from a bag that's been stitched. So in order to do that, I'm going to add a new fill layer, and then I'm going to turn off the color and turn on the height and bring the height up all the way. And then I'm going to add a black mask. And then on this mask, I'm going to go back to my effects panel and look for Add Fill. Then under Grayscale, I'll click that and click Anchor Points and click my Stitches pattern. Now you can see all it did here was it referenced this mask here. So you can see this mask and this mask are completely identical. But because we've referenced it, we can use this mask to modify and manipulate what this fill layer is affecting, which is the height. So if we click on this mask here, and I'm going to alt click so I can see what's going on, I'm going to start adding effects on top of this in order to try and get that indent I'm after. So with the mask selected, I'm going to first start by adding a filter. I'm going to look for an effect called high pass. I'm going to click that. Now remember, in the world of texturing in 3D, black means 0% and white means 100%. And so since our fill layer is set to 100%, on our mask, everything that's white is going to be at the highest point and everything that's black is going to be at the lowest point. So you can see based on this that the height that's been affected on our models makes sense because these stitches are up high and there's a little bit of an indent down low. But I want to push this a little bit further. So I'm going to go back to my mask and click on my high pass. I'm going to bring down the radius of this high pass a little bit more. That should do a pretty good job, yeah. So you can see, just like in a leather bag that had been sewed, we have this kind of indent here, and then the stitches end up coming back up. That's looking nice. So I also want to do one other thing with this texture. So you can see there's this problem where the actual stitching has this leather texture on top of it. Now, luckily, we can use the information from our original mask in order to fix that. Because everywhere that this mask is white, we want the leather height to be removed, right? So if I bring this leather grain above this fill layer here, and then I add a mask to it, so I'll add a white mask, and then I'm going to add a fill to that, and I'm going to reference stitches anchor point. But you see it's kind of doing the reverse of what we want it to. So I'm going to go back to my effects, add levels, and then invert that. So now you can see that everywhere that the stitching is happening, that leather texture is removed. And again, because all of this is non-destructive, we can always come back in and we can change the base color of our stitching to maybe a lighter brown to this. And even if you see here our stitching is, there's some bleed of the leather into where the stitching is. And so we could even go back to our leather mask and add another effect in order to get that to work the way we want it to. So you can see I can just use a levels to kind of expand where I'm blocking out that leather texture. So if I go back to my leather texture, we can kind of see it working in real time. So I'm just jutting that texture out. But you see, what we might actually want to do is we might want to add that effect to the master stitching pattern rather, because that way it will affect all of our other layers. So I'm going to add levels, and I'm just going to add levels to the mask. Bring that under the stitches anchor point. Let's just make sure we know what's happening. There we go. We can just adjust that until it's looking the way we want. We could even add a blur. Then I might actually add a blur to the layer that's affecting my height, just to kind of round out that stitching. That's looking not bad. And you can keep working to get the effect you're specifically looking for. So for instance, I might add a roughness channel to my stitches just so that I can make them less shiny. But yeah, I like that. And again, the really cool thing about all of this is because this is non-destructive, we have so much control, or we can add or subtract as much of this as we want. So if I go back to my original stitches layer and click on the mask icon, I could draw anywhere I want on this model, and I'll wait for it to load. Because all of this is non-destructive and procedurally based, I can draw anywhere I want on this model, and it will apply the same effects that I created wherever I draw it. And so that's really, really powerful, and it allows you to stack up and develop your own textures and styles to get exactly what you're looking for. Now, I want to go over one more kind of example where it comes to anchor points, and that is with micro detailing. And so let's go to our hardware texture, and I'm going to add just a layer. I'm going to look for normal. Let's see, let's find a texture, just like a widget texture or something. Let's use this guy. Okay. And on this layer, I only want the normal to be affected. Then I'm going to drag this kind of icon into our normal channel, and then I'm going to add this texture to my brass. You see, it looks really cool. Now, what if we wanted to add kind of a rust wear effect to it? And yeah, it might not be super realistic for something like brass, but stick with me. So if we add a rust to the sky, and then we add cavity rust smart mask, you can see something kind of unrealistic happens. The smart mask is doing a really good job at adding that rust and wear to certain parts of our model, but it's completely ignoring this normal map kind of button. And the reason that is because smart masks use mesh maps in order to dictate where the mask is applied. And since this normal map icon wasn't baked in our mesh maps, our smart mask is completely ignoring it. There is a way that we can tell Substance Painter to recognize it and apply textures to it, and that's through micro detailing. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to add an anchor point to the layer that our normal map is applied to. So if we click this and add an anchor point, then what we need to do is we need to go to our smart mask and click on this mask generator, and then we need to scroll until we find this drop down that says micro details. And I'm going to make both micro height and micro normal true. And all we need to do is we need to make sure our mask editor is selected, and then scroll all the way down. This is under, let's see, image inputs. So click that and scroll all the way down. And then under micro normal, we need to click that, and then under anchor points, click our layer. And then we take a look at reference channel. It's referencing the base color. So if we switch that to normal, we can see that Substance Painter is now recognizing that normal map as part of the model. And so it's using the smart mask to apply to it. Now, again, this doesn't look super realistic. Just for my own sanity, I'm going to change this to something that's more likely to look rusted. So you can see it's added that micro normal to the mask. And again, we can always come in and adjust certain elements of the mask to push the detail. Now, I just showed you how to do this with a normal map layer, but you can also do this with height map layers. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new fill layer instead of just a new layer. And I'm going to turn off the color, but turn on the height. And then I'm going to add a black mask to this fill layer. And I'm going to find a texture or an alpha that I want to stamp on. I think I'm going to add this kind of bone cross thing. So I'm going to stamp that in, and I'm going to make sure that my fill layer, that the height is set to either 1 or -1. That way I can just see what's happening. And then I'm going to just stamp that guy in. So now I have that kind of indent embossed look on here. I'm going to maybe modify the level of height just to get out what I'm looking for, like that. And now that it's embossed the way I want, all I need to do is go back to my mask layer, and then if I go to my effects panel, add an anchor point, then I'm going to bring this layer below my rust, because anchor points are only read beneath the layer that's being affected by them. And so since our metal rust is being affected by the anchor points below it, those anchor points need to be below it in order to affect anything. So I'll go to my mask editor on my metal rust, and then I'll scroll down to my micro detail panel. Then under levels, we have our micro height, and I'll click that, and I'll look for my anchor point, which is the fill layer 1 mask. And you can see the rust is affecting around that kind of crossbones design, just like it is around that normal map design. And so just in conclusion, anchor points are extremely powerful. We went through some really common uses of anchor points, but ultimately an anchor point, all it's doing is it's recalling information from a previous layer. And so you can use this for so many different things. I've used this to create embers on like a burning letter, but there are a lot of use cases. And so I'd recommend experimenting with it, but remember that all it is you're referencing previous layers into your new mask or layer. So that's all I have for today. Thanks guys for taking a listen and have a good one. Thanks. Bye.